This is a short video to discuss portfolio performance evaluation factors, in other words, portfolio statistics, how you would use them, where they're important. Begin by thinking about what is your benchmark for what you're trying to do. Is this your whole portfolio? Do you want to compare this to a universe of other pension plans, other endowments? Do you want to compare this particular part of your portfolio to a U.S. stock benchmark like the S&P 500? Or are you just trying to make money and not lose it? So it simply could be inflation plus 5%, inflation plus 3%, depending on your risk profile. So the first thing you want to do is say, what is my benchmark? What am I trying to do? Performance, of course, is return on investment. Risk we usually measure in terms of standard deviation of returns. This is the most common metric, but of course there are others. And then the question of correlation. If my benchmark that I'm trying to beat is the S&P 500, what if the portfolio I choose doesn't correlate with it? Well, that's bad, because then I have a much higher risk of not achieving my goal of beating the S&P 500. If there's a down market, I might have a portfolio that reacts much more severely than the S&P 500. If there's an up market, I might have a portfolio that doesn't keep up or is much more volatile. So the correlation is an important consideration. Common sense is a bigger driver, of course. The tools that we'll use are, at least the first tools, are beta. How does my portfolio correlate and respond versus my benchmark? For example, if the S&P 500 is my benchmark and the S&P 500 is up 10% and my portfolio is up 11%, it could be that if the S&P 500 was down 10%, my portfolio would be down 11%. If that's the case, then I have a beta of 1.1. My portfolio moves much more than, or at least more, in this case 10% more, than the benchmark that I'm looking to compare myself to. A beta of 2 would say if the S&P 500 is up 5%, I'm up 10. If the S&P 500 is down 5%, I'm down 10%. It moves twice as much as my benchmark. Alpha is the value that's added on top of your benchmark returns. So in the example that we're looking at, or we're just discussing, if we have the S&P 500 as our benchmark, it's up 5%. We're up 10% because we have a beta of 2. We move twice as much as the S&P 500 just because of the way we've put the portfolio together. But what if we're up 15 in one period? That extra 5% is probably alpha. That's clever stock selection. That's some sort of way we've added value to the portfolio beyond it just adding beta to it. The return of the total portfolio is shown here is alpha plus beta times the market return. So as the examples I spoke about before, just follow that formula. If the market return is 5% and beta is 2, that part gives you 10%. If you do something clever and add 5% in performance, then the total portfolio return would be 15%, adding those two pieces together. Tracking error is the standard deviation of excess returns. What we're doing there is saying how accurately does our portfolio track our index? And if our portfolio doesn't track our index closely, that means there's a risk that we might not perform like the index. If we can add value to that, that's a good thing. And that'll take us to our next page here. Information ratio is taking alpha that we calculate from the equation before and comparing it to tracking error. Because when we change our portfolio from the benchmark, that's usually how it would work. You'd start with the S&P 500 if you want to track the S&P 500 and then say, how can I make this better? How can I do this better than the S&P 500? It's how much have you added in performance, that's your alpha, and how much risk have you taken on, that's your tracking error. And the ratio is called information ratio, alpha divided by tracking error. Also, you can look at this in terms of the information ratio being some skill factor times the square root of how many bets per year you make. And the reason that looking at that might be valuable is if you can quantify and manage your skill factor, then you can look and say, how many bets do they make a year? Why is that important? Well, let's say you go to a casino and you put $1 million on black 13. Well, if you get black 13, that's great, but you've got one chance to do it. Let's say you think you have some edge, and it tells you black 13 has a better chance than other bets you could make, but you just get one try. Well, if you actually have a statistical advantage, you'd be much better off making a million $1 bets on black 13 or whichever bet you felt was the best bet. And by making that million bets, you probably get very close to your statistically expected return as opposed to either make it or I don't. Another metric that's often used is a Sharpe ratio. And this was a concept pioneered by Bill Sharpe, a professor at Stanford who's now retired, emeritus professor now. And that's taking what is your portfolio return, subtracting the risk-free rate, which is usually measured by 90-bill Treasury bill rates. So essentially, how much did I make versus what I would have made if I took no risk at all, and then divide that by the standard deviation of the portfolio. Now, note that the Sharpe ratio denominator contains both market risk and manager risk. So you could have a time when the market's down, your portfolio's down, and this measurement becomes not so meaningful. However, information ratio only contains manager risk in the denominator and manager outperformance in the numerator. So it's a much better measurement in that way. The last thing I wanted to talk about is max drawdown. It's a very simple concept, and I think it's a very important concept. Because if you go to a manager and say, well, I don't know what the future is going to look like, but I think the best measure of the future is probably the past, the best predictor of the future. So you look at their record, and in the past, the worst period they had was losing 25%. I'm just making up an example here. So at one point, if you had invested the worst possible timing for them, and they lost 25% of the money, and then they got back on their horse and started continuing to make money again, the loss that they experienced from the peak to the trough, the very worst one, each one of those is called a drawdown. Anytime you lose money and then go back to making it again, that period was called a drawdown. And the worst one is called a max drawdown. So the concept is that if I have the worst possible luck, and I put money with a manager right now, and they do as bad as they've ever done in the past, how bad is that? And so that's a very simple and very powerful and helpful tool in considering the risk in a simple way, but actually very valid way when considering a manager. So I look forward to our discussion online, and I hope this has been helpful.